Welcome. Thank you for coming to give evidence today. This is the third session in our science budget inquiry, but it's also your first appearance before us, the new committee. I hope that it will be the first of many, both formal and informal sessions. Before we sort of get into the details of spending and you give us words of wisdom from your experience, you kindly sent through a document which should come to me and the clerks with some details about priorities for the Government Office for Science for this Parliament. I wonder if you could give a bit of an overview for colleagues here who haven't seen it.
Of course, thank you very much indeed, Madam Chairman. So first of all, may I start by welcoming and congratulating you and the members of the committee, and I look forward to assisting you with your inquiries over the course of this Parliament. And I'd also like to thank you for your letter on the publication of the SAGE minutes relating to the Ebola crisis, and to let you know that these have been published on the web today. So they will be available in time for your inquiry on the use of science in emergencies. So we're similarly publishing the five-year plan for the Government Office for Science, which will be available very, very shortly. But my job broadly is to advise the government on all aspects of science, engineering, technology and social science for all of government policy. And in some sense you can divide the job into science for government policy, so how it affects electricity capacity margins and things like that. And then of course what this inquiry is about, which is policy for science, which is only a part of my job. So my priorities are those of the government, which are essentially to protect the security and safety of us, the population, and to grow the economy and raise productivity. And science, which I'll use in a sort of slightly all-encompassing way from now on, has a crucial role in all of these. And I have a particular role to ensure that the government has the science capability it needs to tackle the cross-cutting issues from a perspective at the heart of government. So you've seen the work plan, and I won't spend a lot of time on it now. But essentially, it focuses on the sort of four government key priorities. So on supporting national growth and increasing the UK's productivity, we're doing a lot of work at the moment through a Technology Innovation Futures project, looking at future disruptive technologies and how they can be applied for the benefit of the economy, but also for the benefit of how government and others do their work. So, for example, how government uses data to make better policy, and equally how it uses to deliver services more effectively. On supporting regional growth, for example, the Foresight Cities project is looking at what cities will be like in 2065, so a little way off. We've been conducting seminars in cities around the country, and that's important for the regional agenda. On using technology to develop modern and more cost-effective public services, we're partnering, for example, with the Office for Life Sciences to deliver the NHS testbed programme, which will be an environment to help the NHS get the most of digitisation. And an important part of our work is on hopefully trying to prevent crises, but addressing them when they happen and mapping security risks. And we work through SAGE, the Scientific Advice Group in Emergencies, to provide inputs into COBRA, and we provide support to the National Security Council through a committee with the acronym of NSCOS&T, which stands for National Security Committee, Officers, or Council rather, Officers, Science and Technology. So that is it in a nutshell. I imagine you'll want to spend more time on it on another occasion.
It's quite a large nutshell.
Yes.
I'm sure that colleagues might want to pick up on various of those points, but I'm going to stick to the inquiry just because we're quite pressed for time today. We received evidence from BIS for the inquiry, and it included a particular paragraph which said that the government's chief scientific advisor takes an overview of science and research spending decisions across government, considers their implications for evidence-based policy making. All departments are required to consult GCSA and HMT in advance of any potential cuts to research budgets or expenditure, including those that have implications for funding of cross-cutting research. Then we received a second set of evidence from CASE, which tells us that departmental R&D spending makes up about 40% of the government's total expenditure on R&D, and between 2009 and 2012, half of all departments have reduced R&D expenditure by 20% or more. So I just wondered if this sort of submission that we've received from BIS is accurate in your experience? Are you being properly consulted, given the scale of R&D cuts across government? Do you think that CSAs and departments are having proper input to the spending review?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that, of course, my role is an advisory role, and ultimately it's ministers that decide these things, and I'm not accountable for the individual budgets. And indeed, I work very closely with the chief scientific advisors in each government department. And of course, those figures that you've given the headlines to disguise the fact that some departments are going up and other departments are going down. So it's not entirely a negative picture. For example, the Department of Health budget went up from 932 million in 2010 to 952 in 2013. So that has been maintained. I regularly speak to both permanent secretaries and my CSA colleagues, and it won't surprise you that as the government chief scientific advisor, I think having the best science in order to make the best policy decisions, for example, around diseases such as bovine tuberculosis or the use of pesticides, that depends on good evidence. So I am always making the case for R&D. Am I always successful in my endeavours to maintain R&D budgets? Then the answer to that is these are ultimately ministerial decisions, and some of them have been cut.
And the second part of my question, do you think that in addition to yourself, CSAs are getting a proper hearing? I accept that they're advisory roles, but nevertheless, do you think that they're being taken seriously?
Yes, I do think they are getting a proper hearing. I mean, that's a very broad question, and there are lots of different CSAs. They, almost without exception, are well positioned within their departments on the senior committees of the departments. My experience is that they do have access to ministers and that their advice is heard. But of course, as I often say, science is one of the lenses through which policymakers look when they're making decisions, but they also have to look through their political lens and also the lens of policy deliverability. So do they always take the science advice? No, but they're the policymakers, we're the advisors.
Now, at the last session, we had a very interesting set of evidence from Innovate UK and a number of others, during which we all got rather exercised about these diagrams from the Dowling Review, which map out the innovation landscape and the funding mechanisms through which researchers and businesses can access support. In your role, what sort of engagement are you going to have with the Dowling recommendations for simplification of support for innovation and research, and what do you think will be the impact on the spending review?
So I have close and almost daily interactions with the research base in BIS. Again, I'm not part of the sort of, as it were, the line of command, but I am in close, regular contact with them. And I think Anne Dowling had a very nice expression about hiding the wiring in her report. And when you look around the world, and that's one of the things that we've been doing through the Newton Fund, which is a partnership through ODA money with other countries, you see that almost every country has a rather complex network of different sources of funds. And indeed, when I was the director of the Wellcome Trust, it was sometimes put to me, well, why don't you put all your money together with everyone else? And the answer is that if you do that, you only get one chance to fail, whereas when there are multiple schemes, then you get multiple opportunities. So actually having complexity isn't entirely a bad thing. But I do think that the landscape is excessively complicated, and I think some of the wiring can be concealed. And I think that that is part of Paul Nurse's review, which I guess we might come on to as well, although he's met you directly. But I think it's something that BIS is constantly doing, which is actually reviewing and making sure that the mechanisms work as seamlessly together as possible. And I know that the government is looking at Anne Dowling's recommendations at the moment, and we'll come back later in the year with a response.
Thank you. Derek Thomas.
Well, we've been very efficient. I think my questions have already been dealt with, so if you want to move on to the next one, that's
Victoria
great.
Borick.
Thank you.
Just going back then to this targets and overall spending on research and development in terms of percentage of GDP, it was touched on briefly, I think, one of the earlier sessions. Have you got a view on raising the idea of a GDP-based target with ministers, or do you want another way?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that I was taught very early on in science that actually a percentage, it rather depends on the denominator. And so 50% of a little is still rather little, and 1% of a lot is a large amount of money. So actually simply having a percentage GDP target may not be the most sensible. But having said that, the OECD figures speak for themselves. I've got them here. And of course, the R&D targets are, it's a mixture of the public and the private. But again, in my role as government chief scientist and recognizing that our modern world is shaped by the application of science, engineering, technology, and the social sciences, it would be rather strange if I didn't think that it was good to spend effectively on R&D and innovation, because we've got a superb research base in our universities and in our institutes, and indeed in industry as well, and we have to make sure that that is applied for all of the benefits that it brings. And as others have told you, of course, I think it's widely recognised that we have one of, if not the most efficient research bases in the world. So in terms of pounds spent, we get extraordinarily good value, both in the public and the private sector. Would I wish that it was more? Well, I am, as I say, the chief scientist, but I don't decide. Ministers make those decisions, and obviously they make them in the context of all the other spending priorities.
While we're talking about that, the EU's aspirational target of spending 3% of GDP on R&D was determined. And do you know what role that we played, and the UK played, in setting that EU target, or does it come direct?
That was well before my time, I think, and I don't know the answer to that.
No.
But as I say, 3%, the GDP of European countries varies so much that it's difficult to see that's an entirely, I hesitate to use the word rational, but rational approach.
Thank you. And the final question I had is why we noticed that the Office of National Statistics persists in publishing international comparative figures for R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Do you have a reason for why it's done that way, in view of particularly of your other remarks?
Well, I mean, unless you know what the GDP is, you have to do a multiplication. But I mean, it's you need to ask the ONS that, I'm afraid.
No problem at all. Thank you. Chris Green.
Do you have any grounds for believing that the judgments of ministers on the optimal level of science funding will differ substantially from 2010?
I think that really is a question you'd have to ask ministers. As I say, my job is to advise them, and mind reading is not a sort of subject for scientific.
So, we heard last week about British science is still producing excellent research. It's still world leading in so many ways. We're expecting to balance the budget 2018-2019. Surely that should give us some cause to believe there'll be an increase in the budget over that time. But I take it you're still going to remain neutral on this?
Well, I mean, as I say, I do encourage ministers to take a positive view to spending on science, and I think if you look at the record of the previous government and the fact that actually new money was found, particularly for capital, throughout the last government, I am optimistic by nature.
Tanya Mathias.
Thank you. If, and let's hope not, if the science budget were to decrease in real terms, do you have an idea of specific programmes that might be affected?
No, and I don't think that has been decided. But I think that it would need to be partly on a balance in fundamental research on maintaining the absolute principle of excellence, and clearly there would need to be some strategic judgments as well. And I mean, to some extent, again, the review by Sir Paul Nurse, which is looking at how the effectiveness of our excellent research councils can be made even more effective, I think that's the sort of question that he will be thinking about as well.
Okay, thanks.
One of the comments that we had from the Minister when he appeared for us in our first session was that he felt that the research councils could be playing a better role in foresight work, which is obviously part of the role of the Government Office of Science. I wonder what your view is, given that this is sort of right at the centre of what the Nurse Review is looking at, and how you think research councils could be playing a better role in foresight and sort of strategy, really.
Well, I think there, in a sense, there may be two parts to that question. So I think understanding the science landscape in the UK is absolutely essential in order to make the best decisions. And I think that that is an important role for the research councils, and I'm sure that's something that Sir Paul will look at. In terms of foresight work, then I think the challenge, and horizon scanning, call it what one will, I think the challenge is to make sure that that is properly joined up within government. It's something that your predecessor committee looked at. The Cabinet Secretary has an advisory group, called CSAC, imagine, the Cabinet Secretary Advisory Group, and I co-chair a group with an equally curious acronym, which is GOSH, which stands for Government Oversight of Scanning the Horizons. I think it's anyway, let's not go there. Which I co-chair with John Day, who's the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And so actually horizon scanning across government itself is well joined up. And I think that that raises another important question, which is, of course, the relationship between the spending of the research councils and the R&D spending of individual departments. And because it is important that government has a lot of scientific questions to which it needs answers. So if we are going to solve the problems, for example, of plant and animal health, where there are all sorts of diseases lurking either within our borders or outside, then that needs good R&D. And so there needs to be close working also between the research councils and the rest of government in terms of the R&D needs of government as well. Though clearly an extremely important and fundamental aspect of research council spend is supporting people answering important scientific questions and discovering things that we don't know about, and we don't quite know what their applications will be until they've been discovered.
Thank you. I feel a recommendation for hiding the wiring of government acronyms coming on.
Yes,
Jim Dowd.
Thank you, Chair. Of course, in these days of advancing Wi-Fi, wiring becomes less and less prevalent. Biz told us that, and the Minister indeed told us, that their focus in deciding spending priorities in science is on the outputs and the benefits the investment in science brings to the economy and society more generally. Do you think they're well placed to make those judgments?
I think that I think that is where, if you like, we may come on to the Haldane principle, but I think making the decision about who are the best scientists, who are the brightest minds to support, that is an expert decision, which is best done by the process of peer review, which I think has served science very well, not only here but around the world. I think there are two slightly separate issues, though. I think that there are some areas of research which declare themselves as important, and a very good example of that would be Ebola. And so it would be a funny system where a disease such as Ebola emerged and there wasn't the capacity to respond to that with the necessary research. But equally understanding the fundamental mechanisms of how, for example, plants defend themselves against viruses led to the discovery of small interfering RNAs, which have proved to be profoundly important tool across biology. All of the gene editing discovery has come from very fundamental research. And when it comes to the choice of do you fund scientist A or scientist B, when it came to Ebola, for example, then that is an expert judgment, which is best done by people who actually understand how scientists work and the quality of their outputs.
Mm-hmm. You've individualised that very much in your response, rather than, I was thinking more in terms of general projects which need to be funded. But you're saying you really look at who's doing it.
I think you can divide it into two. I think there is the strategic question as to how you prioritise one area against another. So how much you might spend on plant disease as opposed to animal disease, and there are some strategic decisions there. And they, I think, a lot of players, I think, are entitled to have a voice there. When it comes to whether you should fund Professor X or Dr. Y to answer a particular question, then requires a different expertise.
It's just that if they're focusing on outputs, Research Councils UK last week suggested to us that a typical time lag for research outputs was anywhere between 0 and 20 years. Now, given the fact that so far down the road, some activities may be so far down the road. How on earth can they know that now when deciding spending priorities?
No, it's not research outputs with respect, it's research impact. So research outputs...
No, they said outputs. That's what they told us in their submission.
Okay, well, I would distinguish between the two. I mean, the research outputs usually come in reasonably close proximity to the research itself, although a data set may be generated which is still giving outputs many years later. It's the impacts that typically take an enormously long time to emerge. And so, for example, graphene, the sort of the discovery, and that came quickly, but the impacts of what uses graphene can be put to may take many years to fully be developed.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Matt Warman.
For the ring fence, now that capital and resource is ring fenced together, is that an acknowledgement that we were getting that it was? Do you think it was an error for it not to be ring fenced in the first place? And is it a sign that there is a greater understanding that science needs the certainty of funding for the future?
Well, I mean, I think there are many areas where if you're looking at long-term outputs, then you need preferably stability of policy. And I think that it is an important signal that the government attaches to the scientific research, that it has been prepared to put a ring fence around it. Of course, the critical question is how much money is in the ring fence, but I think the very fact that it is ring fenced has been an important signal and a long-standing signal to the research community that the government does in fact value that fairly fundamental scientific research.
Do you feel as though and anticipate that that's going to continue as well?
Again, you would have to ask the ministers that. As I've indicated, as it were, my preference for my answer, but you would have to. It's not my. I'm the advisor.
Just a very minor point. Are there potentially any disadvantages of putting resource and capital into the same but ring fence?
Well, I suppose there's the disadvantage that what's out of the ring fence is therefore less protected in some ways. But so I think you have to look again. It's a denominator question. You have to look at what's in and what's out. Yeah.
So, I mean, Innovate UK is currently responsible for the catapults.
It's responsible for the catapults, yes.
Which obviously have an important role in stimulating research along various stages of tech transfer. Now, evidence which we've received is that some of those don't necessarily have the resource necessary to be at optimal operational level. You obviously have a different perspective sitting in the position that you do. Do you think that the resource which is following the capital is necessary to be, this phrase, sweating the assets? Do you think it's at the right level?
Well, I think that Lord Krebs, the previous chairman of the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee, put it very nicely when he talked about batteries not included. If any organisation funds capital, then it's odd if it then doesn't fund the revenue that goes to maximise the value of the capital. Now, there's obviously an issue of how long you go on funding the revenue associated with any particular capital investment. Because capital is invested in Project X doesn't necessarily mean that the revenue should go on until the time ceases, as it were. In the case of the catapults, they're still in an early phase, and it clearly is important for a good balance to be maintained between the capital and the revenue. And
so are you aware of cases where there is not sufficient resource?
I have not looked into that in detail. I have heard the comments. I think that the catapults are still, almost all of them, at a very, very early stage of gestation. It's to be hoped that they will be successful, but I mean, they are a series of new organisations. Some of them are likely to succeed more than others, but I'm sure that it's a topic that Innovate UK, which has a fair amount of flexibility within its own budget as to how it chooses to use its budget, will keep an eye on it itself.
Liz McInnes.
Following on from the triennial review of the research councils, we've also got ongoing reviews, and you've already referred to the NUS review. We've also got an ongoing review from McKinsey. Could you outline how these 3 different reviews will interact and how they'll feed into the spending review decisions about the science budget?
Well, the nurse review, as you know, was set up as part of following the science and innovation strategy that was published in the last government. Its terms of reference are publicly available. I could read them out, but there's no point really. And they are about picking up some of the points that were raised in the triennial review about making sure that there's, for example, the most effective coordination between the research councils, that interdisciplinary research is well funded. So Paul is looking at that. The Dowling Review, of course, was looking very specifically at innovation, how we, if you like, turn knowledge into money as opposed to turning money into knowledge. The McKinsey Review is, I think, actually rather lateral to all of this. So it's a review on the operational effectiveness in BIS and of all of the arm's length body that BIS looks at. So it's looking at managerial issues rather than how they fund their science. I haven't been party to that, and I think it's actually, I think it is a very different. I don't think it's duplicating Nurse or Dowling in any sense at all. It's looking at BIS very broadly, the arm's length bodies very broadly, and so inevitably the research councils are one of those groups of bodies.
Yeah. So what impact do you think the McKinsey Review will have?
I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
Right.
I have not. I was not consulted by the McKinsey Review, and as I say, I believe that the research councils are a rather small part of the McKinsey Review. But I'm not the right person to ask that because it is a BIS review, and although we get our pay and rations from BIS, we are not part of BIS.
Okay. So you say you have no input into the McKinsey Review.
Oh, I'm sure it has importance, but in terms of the science budget, I don't think that's what the McKinsey Review is primarily about.
Okay, thank you. So
I think if you want the real chapter and verse, then I think you have to ask BIS officials.
Okay, thanks. Carol Monaghan. Yeah.
Universities UK are pointing to the significance of a university-centric nature of the UK science space. To what extent do you feel the health of UK science is linked to this large amount of research funding going to universities?
Well, I think one of the great strengths of the science system and one of the great strengths of our British universities, which is we all know are amongst the best in the world, I mean they are extraordinary, is because a great deal of research is located in universities. And so students in research-intensive universities have the opportunity to be educated in an environment where scientific inquiry is being pursued. Other countries, the balance is different. So, for example, in Germany, the balance is far more towards research institutes such as the Max Planck Institute in Helmholtz. Frankly, I don't think these things are either or. I think we need a mixture of institutes and universities. People can devote different fractions of their time to different activities depending on whether they're in a pure research institute, whether they're doing their research in business, whether they're doing it in a university. There are some things which are more effectively done in an institute environment than in university. And so, for example, the sequencing of a third of the human genome, which happened at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, was probably much more effectively done in an institute environment which was essentially running a 24/7 factory. And so I think it's actually not an either-or, it's how we have an appropriate balance between institutes and universities. And I think also that institutes have an extremely important catalytic activity in bringing universities together. So if you take the Francis Crick Institute, which will be opening fully for business in the first part of next year, that has had a very powerful catalytic effect on enabling King's, Imperial and University College to work together. The new Alan Turing Institute, which will open in just a couple of months' time, again, there's a partnership of 5 universities behind that. So I think institutes can also be the glue that enables universities to work together. And of course, the important thing is that the boundaries between different scientific environments are as permeable as possible. And I think that's one of the challenges, so that ideally academics can move between institutes and universities throughout their training, there should be permeability between the world of business and the world of universities. And indeed, in the Government Office for Science, we have interns from universities, typically during their PhDs, who learn a little bit about the application of science to government policy. So none of these things are alternatives, they're complementary to each other.
Whilst they are complementary, do you think we should be moving from the majority of research funding going to universities, or should we be looking at these alternative institutes as places where we should be?
I think that we have a good balance, and I think that the vast majority of research funding is in universities. It would take an enormous shift to change that, and I don't detect any appetite for that to happen.
Okay, thank you.
And again, institutes can be embedded in universities. These things are not quite as distinct as is sometimes portrayed.
Okay, thank you.
Jim Dowd.
Can I just look briefly at innovation? The government has a declared intention of making the UK the best place in Europe for innovation.
Yeah.
How can we measure their progress towards achieving that goal, or lack of it, as the case may be?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it will ultimately show in the spectrum of businesses that are contributing to the UK economy. And I think we can already see the signs of that in terms of the clusters of knowledge-intensive companies that are developing in many parts of the country. So around Dundee, for example, in computer games, Tech City in London, the extraordinary cluster that is around Cambridge. So I think that we see this through the evidence of the economic growth that is accompanied.
You mentioned previously the importance and the central role, indeed, if I understood you correctly, the dominant role of universities in research capability in the UK. Do you think the current measurements of how they're doing are adequate?
Yes, I think that I was talking about public sector research there. One shouldn't neglect the extraordinary power of R&D in business and industry as well. Some of it is of a sort of classical variety that you would recognise in an AstraZeneca or a GSK, or the engineering that you would see in a Rolls-Royce, or the computer engineering that you would see in a company like Arm. But obviously we have a very strong SME sector. I think one of the challenges is to grow SMEs into medium enterprises, so it's where patient capital will come from. Research in the private sector is also extraordinarily important. And of course, if you look at the R&D, there is more, and this is around the world. In the UK, it's about 0.5% of GDP, and I'm sorry, I'm quoting it in percentages, that's the way everyone does it, but as opposed to 1.23 in the private sector. Interestingly, if you look at Israel, it's 0.48% of GDP in the public sector and 3.5% in the private sector. So actually the sort of R&D question is at least as much a question about business as it is about the public sector funding as well. And I think one of the interesting issues in the UK is the shape of the UK economy, which is very dominated by services, financial services. And they tend not to talk about R&D, but they actually do quite a lot of it. So there is a sort of issue of taxonomy as well.
There's the apparent growing focus on impact, the term you used earlier, helpful in measuring this? And are there any other metrics we really need to improve?
Impact is a bucket measurement. I mean, impact aims to encompass all the measures of what has happened as a result of science and innovation. So it's within impact, it could be improvement in healthcare. It could be better operations of a facility. There are all sorts of ways in which impact can be had. So everything from aesthetic impact through to commercial impact.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Derek Thomas has the final question.
My question relates to the Haldane principle, and the previous panel were very generous in their reply, so hopefully you'd be also. Who knows best, the researchers or the politicians, when it comes to, and so in terms of the Haldane principle, when it comes to the new agenda for promoting regional growth and how us politicians are getting behind that. Does that concern you? Is that threatening the Haldane principle?
No. So the first thing is I would strongly commend the Haldane report on the machinery of government. I think, with respect, I would recommend that you all read it. It's a wonderful report because it was on the whole machinery of government. It was from the Ministry of Reconstruction 1918. Haldane actually had 6 principles, and there's too much focus on one of them. And these were actually set out in the Science and Innovation Strategy. His first principle was that research and evidence was important to the development of government policy. And I think I say amen to that. The second one is that each government department should provide funds to answer specific policy questions. The third one is that there should be a department of government charged with funding general research questions. Fourth, this is the one to which you're referring, that the choice of how and by whom that research should be conducted should be left to the decision of experts. But 5, that the questions and topics to be tackled should be considered as a result of close collaboration between what he called the administrative and the general departments. And finally, that there should be a department that supports research applied to trade and industry. And actually, in his report, Haldane talked about the nascent Medical Research Council and commended it, and of course this was at the end of the First World War, on the work that had been done looking at problems of national significance during the First World War, problems such as trench foot. And so Haldane was absolutely clear that the research agenda and the sorts of questions that should be answered should be, at least in part, dictated by discussions between government and those in receipt of government funds. The issue of a place-based policy is that it's a mistake to think that excellence is just limited to 1 or 2 parts of the country. There is excellence around the country. But I think the importance is, and I think, if you like, where Haldane comes in, is that excellence does need to be a priority, but there really is excellence everywhere, and therefore it is entirely, I think, to ministers to take a view that the taxpayers' money should be spent in a geographically dispersed fashion. And I think the opportunity is to identify what the strengths are in different parts of the country and to make sure that when money is regionally applied, it's applied on building on strength and not funding the second rate. And I see no sign that there's any appetite to fund anything other than excellence.
That's good. So in terms of the industrial strategies and the Great 8 technologies, having just heard what you've said, would you say that there's no real tension with ministers getting involved in what we would say as picking winners?
Well, I mean, I think that's an unfortunate term because it is a bit toxic. It's like green shoots. But I mean, I'd say a different way of looking at it is that making choices. Choices have to be made. And I think this is about making sure that the choices are good. And it's why it comes back to a question I was asked right at the beginning, the importance of understanding the research landscape, recognising that there is great academic strength throughout the country. And we have to build on that. It doesn't make any sense to put all the money into a tiny fraction of the country. And indeed, that hasn't happened for a very long time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Mark. Thank you very much for your answers today. They're very helpful to us. As I said to other witnesses, we may write to you and follow up on some of the points. Next time you appear before us, I may ask you to provide us with a glossary in advance so that we can interpret your acronyms.
Yes, I'll try not to use them.
Other than that, you've been very generous with your time. I hope that we will see you often. And I now call to table Professor Brian Cox.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. As I've said to other witnesses, this is our 3rd session in our science budget inquiry, and it is kind of you to appear before us to give us evidence on this issue. You've previously been very outspoken when there have been proposed cuts to the science budget, but as we've been discussing throughout this session, and I know that you've heard the evidence, BIS is an unprotected department. It's going to have to find 25 to 40% cuts in this spending review. So I suppose my first question to you is, given your role as essentially an ambassador for science, what do you think is the level of public support amongst taxpayers for funding science at a time when we're having to make choices between welfare and education and all sorts of other sort of top priorities?
Well, yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, the committee, for inviting me to give evidence. I would echo what's been said in this session and in fact in previous sessions, that the question, I suppose, is what is the optimum level of R&D expenditure in an economy that gives you the optimum level of return, because we're talking about investment in growth and therefore investment in future productivity, amongst other things. And it seems that the reason everybody agrees, I noted that everybody agrees on the numbers, it's not because everybody's got together and decided to come to some Machiavellian kind of plan, it's because those numbers are facts as far as everyone can see. And it seems at this level of order, 2.5%, of which about a third is public expenditure and 2/3 is private, seems to be agreed upon, seems to be backed up by all the research that I've seen over many years. And also seems to be, as has already been mentioned, the level that is converged upon in our competitor nations, not only the OECD average actually, but countries like Germany, the USA, etc. So it's exceeded in some, and as has been pointed out, is significantly lower in the UK. And for me, it's surprising and remarkable that we are arguably, well, we're certainly, I think, the most efficient scientific nation in the world, and arguably one of the most effective. You'll have seen the figures from the Royal Society, 15% of the highest cited papers, etc., from 3% of the investment. So it seems to me that the correct answer is the level that the data tells you gives you the biggest return, and therefore the most, the largest possible growth in the economy.
So we heard from the Minister in our first session. He said that we're looking at this backwards. We are going to focus on outputs. If we just look at inputs, then we're misdiagnosing the problem. So if we just sort of obsess about the ring fence, then we've sort of missed the point. So do you think that because we have such a productive science base in this country, we don't need to fund them as much as we need to worry about education or something else?
Well, you can turn that around and say that the fact that we get such tremendous output from a small input means that a slightly larger input gives you an even more tremendous output. That's the way that I'd read that. But it's also true to say that the level of output at the moment, our excellence at the moment, is surely, and all the evidence backs this up, is based on previous investment. We've heard, it's true, there's a big lag time. If you look at the outputs from CERN, for example, those decisions to build something like the Large Hadron Collider were made in the 1980s. Same with the big space missions that are providing our outputs now. So, and if you go back in time, the possibility for generating those outputs, the strength and health of the universities and the research labs themselves, we're reaping the rewards of decisions that were made decades ago. So I think if you're focusing on outputs, then the correct question has to be, what do we have to invest now in order to make sure those outputs at least stay constant and world leading, but actually we would wish become more valuable as time goes on. We're looking at 10 or 20 year timescales.
So the government, this committee, we're very concerned about a shortage in STEM skills. There's a concerted effort from ministers, from MPs in their own constituencies, from representatives like yourself to attract young people, to attract girls in particular into STEM careers. Important plank of that campaign is science communication. But when we look at the BBC budget, that is for the licence fee, that's £1 billion more than the science budget. So when we're going into a spending review, would you say we're spending too much on the BBC or we're spending not too much on science?
I don't think they're linked. I mean, they're but it's a good question. I mean, if I could put the BBC to one side, I'll comment on that in a moment. But it's interesting that you link there the science budget and the research outputs that we have linked to GDP growth, etc., with communication. It's very important that. And if I could just give you one piece of evidence, a small piece of evidence, but I am involved in a school in Tower Hamlets called St Paul's Way, and I'm the patron of the school now. And a while ago, back to 2008, 2007, it was a failing school. And through many interventions and ideas, the idea was to focus the school on science. And I asked, actually, because I knew I was coming here for the outputs of that focus, and they're quite remarkable, actually. So here's a school which focuses on science. It also, very importantly, it collaborates with universities. I think that's a very important point. The value of our universities, our great research-based universities, is, I think, untapped in some sense. That they can make a huge impact by collaborating with schools and in the community. So these figures are quite remarkable. So the cohort going on to study STEM subjects at university increased by 88% since the regeneration of the sixth form in 2012. 100% of those students are from ethnic minorities. 40% of the 2015 cohort are studying engineering courses, compared with 20% in 2012. 50% of the 2014 cohort studying STEM degrees are women, so half of them. You look at the numbers taking STEM subjects, biology AS, 500% increase since 2012. Chemistry, 700% increase. Physics, 150%. Mathematics, 233%. I could go on, they're quite remarkable figures. But the point is that those improvements, so we're seeing the 50% of women going into STEM subjects, 100% of those students, ethnic minorities, in Tower Hamlets, in a deprived area, transforming that area. The reason is that research-active universities, particularly Queen Mary in this case, and also UCL, are in that area collaborating with that school. So that's the impact of a healthy research sector and university sector can be massive. And I see that as a pilot project. The question I ask now is, as we've said, we've got capacity in our research ecosystem and the universities, which is not being taken up because of restricted funding. Once you start increasing that funding a little bit, the gearing of that extra freedom, that's sweating our assets, if you like, can be absolutely massive. And I think the same is true when you talk about the BBC. I mean, obviously the BBC does more than support the science budget, but I think it's, or the science ecosystem, but it's important to note, I think you may have seen I was involved in an announcement with Tony Hall last week about what the BBC wishes to do. And it's got, I think it's taken its responsibility as an institution, a public institution, more seriously than certainly it's ever done since I've been involved with it over the last 10 years or so. Because it recognises that as a bridge to 97% of the British public every week, it can make a difference. It can get these messages across. It can inspire young people as part of its remit. And I think that's extremely important. I think my suggestion actually to the BBC, and actually also part of my involvement with the school at St Paul's Way and others, is just, it's very simple. We have world-leading institutions in this country. We've heard the universities, the research institutions, also the BBC as a public service broadcaster, the schools we've got. If those institutions can work together, in this case in the interest of science, the amplifying effect is tremendous. And so it seems to me that the question we should be asking is, how can we focus and, I think, increase these budgets slightly, if necessary, in order to give us the freedom to do things like this? Because if you replicate that throughout the country, then we transform the economy. We transform the prospects of these young people, and we transform our research base. And I think that's the language we need to be using, actually. We're using quite technical language about small amounts of money. They're relatively small amounts of money as a percentage of GDP, as we've seen, extremely small, actually, by international standards. But they make a terrific impact.
So if that would be the impact of increasing, what do you think would be the impact of reducing the science budget? Well,
I mean, I think we're at... My view, I mean, when I heard I would be called to give evidence, I looked through a lot of the evidence. I looked through all the evidence that's been submitted. And I think I've been in research for 20 years now, roughly speaking. Most of it not on television, most of it actually involved with SDFC and before that PPARC. And it seems to me we're at a crossroads now. And it's a frightening but potentially exciting crossroads. Because if you look at SDFC's submission to the committee, as you have, of course, it's frightening because I've never seen a stronger and more fearful submission to to a spending review from a research council. I mean, I was involved very heavily in the problems just after FGSE was formed, back after CSR 07. And we were, the last time I gave inquiry to this committee actually, was evidence to the committee was in 2010, and we called it a physics funding crisis then, because of the way the merger between PPARC and CCLSE was handled and STFC's budget, which was essentially been flat cash since 2007. And we predicted that there'd be a 25% reduction in PhD students, very large reductions in early career researchers, postdocs, etc. All that's happened. And now it looks like STFC is in a position where unless there's something like a 10% increase in its budget, then it will essentially either pull out of major areas of research or we'll see a collapse in the funding of younger researchers. And that's extremely important. I mean, I won't go into that too. But so the point is that so that's very serious, and I think I get the sense that the same problems exist across all research councils. And I know you've had a lot of evidence for why that is. In STFC's case, it's because we're paying for large facilities and we're just not staffing them with enough researchers. It's kind of an obvious thing. The fixed costs are very large. The flexible costs which pay for the researchers that are going to be the future and drive increases in productivity in the economy are just not there. The reason it's exciting, though, as well, is that I think because we're at that position where we've still got just about a world-leading research base, we've still got the infrastructure there, and we've still got the universities which are still world-leading, we've got a possibility with small increases of generating a terrific gearing in return. Because it's essentially, it's almost like saying imagine we've got the diamond light source sat there and we can't afford to pay anybody to work at it. There's excess capacity there. I mean, obviously we can pay people to work at it, but there's excess capacity, and that's going to grow if STFC gets a flat cash or even worse, or even not a large increase. So by small increases, what you're doing is you're funding scientists to go into those already existing and already paid for infrastructure facilities, those valuable facilities, and generating knowledge, much more knowledge for small inputs. So that's exciting. And just very briefly, the other exciting thing is the change in public attitude I think there's been in science, which goes back to your initial question. When we fought the battles back in 2007 for STFC, one of the things we all noticed was that there didn't seem to be strong public awareness or particularly strong public support in science and for science, and many of us felt that we needed to address that and pay much more attention to outreach, both in schools and to the public in general. That's one of the reasons I got involved in television in the first time, for the time, and that's worked, right? There's no doubt now, if you look at the surveys that are done now, there's an overwhelming majority of people think investment in science is positive for them, positive for their children, and positive for the future of the country, and that's different to what it was 10 years ago. So that means that we're here in a position where increases in funding, I think, will be geared very highly to increases in productivity, increases in economic growth very quickly because we've got the capacity. But also we've got unprecedented support and demand from young people and from the population in general. So that's why I'm excited as well as concerned.
Thank you. Derek Thomas.
Thank you very much. We're talking about public awareness and their enthusiasm for science, and I just want to thank you for the contribution you've made. I've sat in front of the TV with my 8-year-old son, and then it's cost me money, so I don't know how grateful I should be, going and buying kits and various bits and pieces around science.
The productivity gains
so thank you for that. That's brilliant.
You back.
But so clearly the awareness of science has increased, and that's fantastic, and more can be done on that. But does that translate then into a commitment by the public to actually fund it? I mean, in the way that we see, there's been kind of public support for money for the armed forces, public support to help refugees. Do you think that we've done enough to actually get that kind of similar support and enthusiasm for putting taxpayers' money in and behind the science?
Yes is the answer. I'm just looking for the figures, but I think they were in the Royal Society report, the Ipsos Mori survey that was done recently in 2014. Yeah. I think you have those. Let me know. They're somewhere in here. But if I remember rightly, there's something like 75% of the public agreed with the suggestion that funding of science was something that the government should do. And I think, I'll find them for you, they're somewhere in here. Here we are. 8 in 10 agree that even if it brings no immediate benefit, scientific research which advances knowledge should be funded by government. 2/3 disagree that this funding should be cut because the money can be better spent elsewhere. So that's the answer to the question. That was an Ipsos Murray survey in 2014.
So in a difficult funding environment, you think that the public would support a possibly freeze or even increase in science?
Yes, because if it's framed correctly, because as I tried to say in the just talking about this particular school I've been involved in, but the point is that I think we can demonstrate evidentially, but also we can make the point that you get the rhetoric right, the political rhetoric. The rhetoric is that, as George Osborne has said, we want to make Britain the best place in the world to do science. Yeah. Why do we want to do that? Well, not only do we want to grow the economy, but we want opportunities in the knowledge-intensive services and industry for our children. And so I think we often focus too narrowly on the science budget. This is the investment that we're talking about that forms the basis of future prosperity and therefore opportunities for all the students that are at school at the moment, or a large percentage of them. We want them to be in high-skilled industries. You can't have that without a healthy science base.
No, great, thank you. Thank you.
You've been very sort of energised at how you raise the profile of an understanding and attractiveness and the impact of science as a subject. So I commend that, because I think everyone around this table is obviously very motivated by that. So in general, do you think you're optimistic or pessimistic as to how you think the future of science is? Do you think it's going to get better or not? I mean, if there's another flat cash settlement, then realistically it's dire, I think. I mean, and that's not my opinion. It seems to be the opinion unanimously of the research councils. Certainly my area, STFC, absolute disaster. So I would be extremely pessimistic if that's what happened. I mean, I spend a lot of time going to schools and talking to students and telling them that STEM, putting their energies into STEM, is the way that they can secure a better future and have a very enjoyable time while they're doing it. That's true at the moment, but it won't be true if we become a second-class scientific nation. Where will those jobs be? As I said, in the STFC areas, which are particle physics, astronomy, nuclear physics, these high-profile areas, we've seen a 25% decrease in the number of PhD studentships. So what message does that send out? And we're talking about single-figure millions there on budgets, by the way, because the young researchers are the cheapest researchers, but we can't afford to pay them. As I said before, because of that capacity that's still there from previous investment, I think that it's clear that for every extra pound that we spend, we can leverage large amounts of not only increasing productivity and GDP, but I think excitement. It's about messages when you're going to schools. It's like, well, are these areas prosperous? Are they successful? Is it possible for me to go and work for the European Space Agency as an engineer or whatever? These questions are asked by students, and I have to honestly answer them. And I think with a poor settlement in the CSR, how do I answer it honestly? I say, well, it's going to be increasingly difficult. do you have any positive trends that you have seen?
Well, absolutely, as I said in the figures earlier. But I mean, there's also actually. I'll give you one other example, actually, because a bit of evidence I brought with me. I'm also involved in a trust called the John Egging Trust. I ran the Great North Run for them, actually, on Sunday, so I'm still recovering from that. But we focus on children who are having real difficulties for many reasons. So they're selected by schools and put forward for these programmes because their attendance will be low, they'll be disruptive, for many reasons. And so last week I was at an RAF base up at near Lincoln, talking to them, 14, 15-year-olds, and I was sent the feedback. So I taught them about science, and I was sent some of the feedback. So one of them, a 14-year-old, said, after today's talk, I want to achieve my ambitions by thinking more deeply about the universe. One of them, 14-year-old, said, I'm inspired to become a better scientist. One of them said, motivated to learn more about scientific discoveries and to find something I'm passionate about. But these are students, 14 and 15-year-olds, who were sent into the programmes in the trust I put forward for that because they were disruptive. They were going absolutely nowhere. And again, it's through that, it's collaboration as well. You see, what we have there are institutions, the military in that case, the Royal Air Force helping out with leadership programmes. And then the science budget feeds into that with the universities coming in. Then apprenticeships, so companies like BAE Systems are looking at perhaps giving these people apprenticeships. So what you see is if you join up the assets that we've got in this country by not putting so much financial pressure on them that they can't operate and they become narrowly focused, then you get a amplification. The effect is amplified terrifically. And I've seen that. I've given you, they're not anecdotal, there's some evidence there, but I think it speaks volumes to what we could do with the capacity and the capability we have.
Well, that's really encouraging. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Matt Warman.
When it comes to where we're spending the money, though, do you think we are spending it in the right places? Because I think there's always the fear that the sort of big, sexy topics, what get a disproportionate amount of cash, and some of the less exciting but potentially actually more lucrative stuff doesn't get what it deserves. Is that fair? And what would you change if you could?
I think the answer to that is, if you look, I know the Nurse Review is looking at this to some extent, but for me the answer is, how was it that we became the most scientific, the most efficient scientific nation in the world? And we got there over many decades by having a system that works terrifically well. One of the reasons it works, by the way, is because, I think it was already mentioned, there's intense competition in it. And the reason there's intense competition is because we have a throughput of young researchers who are hungry and displace the old guys, basically, in what you see. And actually, if I could quote, there's a good answer to that, I think, for the way that funding is allocated. If you look back to one of the great success stories, so Andrei Geim and Kostya Novoselov at my university at Manchester, winning the Nobel Prize, graphene's been mentioned already. It's a big investment opportunity in Manchester. If you look at Andrei Geim's speech in 2010, it's illuminating, because here's someone who came into the country from Russia initially, through via Holland, and he said, "My greatest thanks are reserved specifically for the responsive mode of EPSRC." Right, so that's what he thanks in his Nobel speech. "The funding system is democratic and non-xenophobic. Your position in an academy hierarchy or an old boys network counts for little. Also, visionary ideas and grand promises to address social and economic needs play little role when it comes to peer review. In truth, responsive mode distributes its money on the basis of a recent track record." And he goes on to say, paraphrasing Churchill, "The UK is the worst funding system except for all the others that I'm aware of." But it's important that, because here's someone who won a Nobel Prize. He came to Britain. I was actually vaguely involved in when he was appointed back at Manchester. I was working there then. He came to Britain because of the freedom, and at the time, that was a time when our science budget was expanding. It was during the time of Lord Sainsbury as Science Minister, when there was a large increase in funding. That brought people like that into the country, and through, as he said, through the responsive mode of EPSRC, backing winners in the sense that you back people with a recent track record who are hungry and young and want to do research, you get things like graphene. And I think that's I could carry on quoting for you. There's one when I was looking through, Bill Gates, I think, had it right, where he said, "I believe in innovation, and the way you get innovation is you fund research." That's it. But these people are worth listening to, though. It's not just a series of quotes. I think it matters. And so there you see a tremendous success story, obviously, for Britain. Multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industry, generated by funding great researchers in a field that didn't even exist, right? He invented the field.
Thank you. But it's not just about, the point in that quote is that the Research Council was responsive and they engaged well with the researcher. One of the pieces of evidence that we've received is about the complexity of the innovation and research landscape and the difficulty that some researchers and businesses have in accessing the funding, even knowing where to go with their idea and their sort of moment of eureka. And so what has been your experience of this? Do you think that this is an indication that we have lots of good different points of access and that's a positive thing, as we've had evidence from some people? Or do you think that this is actually a problem and it's blocking researchers and businesses from finding the right pot for them because it's just too complicated to find the money?
I think in my relatively, because I've worked in particle physics, there tends to be I have limited experience of my own research being immediately of interest to local businesses, just because it tends to happen in particle physics. It's things like medical imaging come out of there, or indeed famously the World Wide Web, so it's a big collaborative thing. So my understanding is that we've done a lot of work, I think, in making individual researchers, certainly at the University of Manchester, aware of their social responsibility, in the sense that you should be aware that if you do a piece of research and you think, well, this could be useful for whatever reason, then you need to be aware of the mechanisms that you go to. Where do you go to you don't just sit there and publish it and leave it. You know, what can you do? So I think that's I'm not an expert in that area, but I would say that I think there's an awareness now amongst researchers that there's whilst curiosity-driven research has always been the foundation for great ideas that transform economies. That's obviously true. It's always been true, and it always will be true. What is important is when you have an idea, you'd make a discovery like graphene. You make sure that first of all, the patents are there. Secondly, the UK leads that translation of that knowledge into economic development, etc. I should say one thing actually, which is also seems to be broadly agreed upon, and it's one of the arguments for a broad research base. And graphene is another good example, actually. So the argument for funding a broad research base, which perhaps goes back to your question about how do we prioritise between areas, it's all the research tells you that you need excellence, if you can, across the whole spectrum. And the reason for that is you do not know where the next ideas are going to come from. They don't have to come from the UK, but in order for the UK to have any chance of translating ideas from anywhere in the world into economic activity and jobs, etc., you need researchers who have been trained, you need PhD researchers and postdocs who've been trained in those areas. They're the engines of innovation. They're the bridge between ideas and industry. So what we do know is that one of the key jobs of university and the science budget is to train that cohort of bridges, if you like, so that when the new knowledge comes in, we can make it work in our economy. That's a necessary but not sufficient part of the innovation process.
Chris Green.
Many fantastic fundamental research projects which capture the public imagination. They're on television, they're in the media a great deal, but over a period of time, naturally the interest fades away. What benefits, practical or otherwise, can the taxpayer expect from fundamental scientific research?
If you look, I mean, you have to look at the past in order to understand what benefit is. It's impossible to predict. For example, I get asked a lot, what's the Higgs boson going to do for me? You know, the answer is I don't know. But I can point back not only to spin-offs. The spin-offs of particle physics are well known. You'll have been presented them. So medical imaging, of course, the World Wide Web, which it almost seems being rather unfair when you talk to economists, because you say, well, how much was that worth? And who knows, a lot. But is it worth pointing out that Tim Berners-Lee said that he doesn't feel it could have been done anywhere else but at CERN, because of the specific challenges we have at CERN with international collaboration, large amounts of data, etc. So that's why one of the reasons CERN drives innovation. But if you look back through history, look at the compact disc player, for example, generated huge revenues for the music industry. It comes from two pieces of basic research. One famously is the laser, which essentially you can trace back to Einstein. Quantum mechanics comes out of the attempt to understand the structure of atoms. There's a very famous quote, actually, when Rutherford discovered the nucleus in Manchester, and someone asked him what use that would be, and he said, well, it certainly won't be an energy source. You're talking moonshine if you think that. And within 20 years, of course, 30 years, we had not only atomic weapons, but the first nuclear reactors. So you can't tell. Other than, it seems to me self-evident that the more you learn about the way that nature works, the more opportunities there are to develop technologies that will increase life expectancy, etc., whatever it is. So another very famous quote I could remember by Fleming, I think I wrote it down somewhere actually, but again it's worth noting. He said, when I woke up just after dawn on the 28th of September 1928, I certainly didn't plan to revolutionise medicine by discovering the first antibiotic. But I think it's a very important point. It seems abstract, and I know in my 10 years or so of dealing with politicians and funding questions that we could give many concrete examples of research leading to a train of innovation and economic benefit. But it's worth pointing out that the things we take for granted now, such as modern electronics, modern healthcare, all those things, came from fundamental curiosity-driven research not long ago.
Yep.
And it's not gone away. That graphene's a good example. That was curiosity-driven research. So it's very important, I think, that we don't lose that lead in Britain.
So we can't, it may be quite a while until we see great innovations from these research projects, but we have a whole catalogue of research projects which we can look to and say, this is a pointer for the future.
You have to, and I would emphasise that it's I think it's virtually impossible, as far as I can see, to pick the next field that will lead to increased economic growth, or by whatever metric you'd like to measure its worth. I just can't see how you can do it. The history of science tells you that it's just a branching random tree a lot of the time. I don't envy people who have to try and, well, I was going to say focus the money. The point is actually that it seems to me the evidence is there that if you have a broad and strong research base, then you take advantage of those discoveries wherever they come from.
Yes, I think we could trade appropriate quotes all day, but one of my favourites is Lord Porter, Nobel laureate. He says there are two kinds of research, applied research and not yet applied research. It's just about timescales. Carol Monaghan.
First of all, can I say it's an absolute honour to have you here today, Professor Cox. And I know many of my former physics students are watching today and are excited about this as well. And I actually, at the weekend, managed to have a conversation with my 16-year-old son simply because you were going to be here. So thanks very much for that. We've talked a lot about science funding. I'm not one you really have to convince on that one. But within that, I think there are other areas or maybe specific things that we maybe could look at. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on how we should be funding women into science and engineering STEM and how we can make science more attractive to them.
It's a terrifically complicated question, and I've tried to look for evidence. I'm asked a lot actually, and you may know that some of the work that's been done has suggested that it can be what puts young women off, because it seems that before the age of about 10, 11, 12, there are a completely democratic distribution of people being excited about everything at school, and somewhere that we lose in physics and engineering. There's some evidence that parental influence, either not necessarily conscious, but just parental biases have a big problem, and the biases of teachers, which again will be unconscious, and the reaction to girls and boys saying different things about what they want to do. It's interesting, though, as I mentioned earlier, to look at the experience at St Paul's Way School, where it's not there. 50% of the students that went into STEM subjects in 2014 were women, young women. So what's been done right there? It's a case study to look at. I don't know. I know it's a complicated issue. So it's easy to say things like role models, etc. I mean, I think that is important. I mean, we go back just to a comment about the BBC. I think one of the things the BBC has taken very seriously and will continue to take seriously is the fact that it can put academics on television, and it thinks very carefully about the spectrum of those academics. So you have people like Alice Roberts and Helen Chersky and Maggie Daring-Pocock. So you get there's a gender balance. There's a balance of people from different backgrounds, but all academics presenting science programs. I do think that's important. And also, I think one of the things, just as an aside, the power of those people who get into the public eye is not just in appearing on television. It's the work that they do afterwards. It's the fact that they're lecturing at universities, they're going into schools. So by making people like, for example, Alice Roberts, national figures, I think the BBC has a multiplier effect because she doesn't go away when she's not filming TV. She's working in schools and at the universities in Birmingham, I think she lectures.
But that will require a financial input, of course, won't it?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things, I've spoken to colleagues about the potential problems at STFC if there's not actually significant, something like a 10% increase in the budget. Otherwise, it's a very rapid, fast decline in the capabilities of that research council. And one of the things that does is it halts the throughput of young researchers immediately. You don't get rid of the old professors. They tend to stay where they are. But we've seen this demographic cliff before. Actually, when I came through as a young researcher, my age group was relatively isolated. There was a big gap up to the old guys because of funding problems in the previous 10 or 20 years. And so if you see that, we'll halt that ability to take those young researchers and use them as role models. They won't be there. For me, the key message is the whole thing's joined up. It's a much bigger thing that we're discussing here. It's not just the science budget. It's the whole thing. It's the inspiring children at school. It's the basis of the knowledge-intensive economy, etc., etc. But when looked at in those terms, I think these become tiny numbers. I mean, when you look at the crisis that we had at STFC back in 2007 and the crisis we're facing now, you're talking about single-figure millions, or tens of millions a year. It's not billions. And the aspiration the Royal Society had of increasing I think it was 0.69% or 0.67% of GDP they were hoping for over the next CSR. So just about catching up with our competitors. We're still talking about single-figure billions, which have a gearing effect of tens of billion percentage points, multiple percentage points on GDP, as far as all the evidence suggests.
Thank you.
Ms. McInnes.
I just wanted to ask you about the contribution made by overseas students to UK science. I know it's been quite a political issue recently, and I wondered what your thoughts were on what funding arrangements and visa regulations would best encourage overseas students to make a contribution to UK science.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendous contribution. You'll know the figures. I think it's something like 13 billion a year.
Yeah.
Everybody who's sensible, as far as I can see, suggests that the student numbers from overseas shouldn't be involved in immigration targets. It's completely indefensible, daft. Everybody, I think, knows that. So the political argument seems to me that it has to be made. This is not, I think, what the controversy about immigration such as it is about. Actually, these, as I say, the economic benefits are clear, the social benefits are clear, the benefit to our soft power is clear. We're talking about the best and brightest people from around the world who are going to come to the UK, be educated in UK universities, and most likely some of them will stay and contribute to the UK economy, some of them will go back and become powerful and influential people across the world. And that soft power is so valuable, I think, probably more valuable than the immediate economic impacts of the fees, etc., those students pay, that we should strive to encourage that immigration. And I should say that I was in India relatively recently, filming for the BBC, and there were headlines in the papers about it was about Indian doctors actually, and there were big headlines about how the UK is clamping down on Indian medical students, Indian doctors coming into the NHS, and it was extremely negative headlines in the Indian press. The impact of I think clamping down on student numbers and postgrads and postdocs, etc., would be horrendous. It's beyond the financial.
Yeah. So do you think it's potentially having a detrimental effect on British science, the sort of whole issue around overseas students coming here at the moment?
Yeah, of course. And the less overseas students we have, the less, in economic terms, the less well-funded our universities will be, because the less fees we will get. But as I say, it goes way beyond that. It's about UK soft power as well.
Thank you.
Matt Warman has the final question.
Finally, briefly, this is a question that came in from the public, but chimes in with my own experience. If I look back to the PhD my wife did, finished in 2006, not a single one of her cohort is now working in academic science. And that seems to be a story across the piece. What do we need to do to fix the sort of career prospects and the sense of what people can do when they are in their, sort of going into their first academic job, and give them a sense of where they're going to end up?
It's, I mean, the first thing to say is that one of the reasons that we all know there's a shortage of trained STEM graduates in the economy. I was actually at an oil industry conference in Aberdeen last week, and even though, of course, the economics of the oil industry is problematic at the moment, the conference was focused on getting young engineers and young people into oil and gas exploration, because they understood that you can't have those demographic cliffs and those big valleys of talent. You invest in a downturn so that you can take advantage of the upturn. And so one of the things to say is that the reason that we have a shortage of STEM graduates going into engineering is because they're so valuable and so well trained in the economy that, as you said, they tend to go into other jobs. That just tells you we don't have enough of them. And how do you get more STEM places? How do you get more people going into PhDs and postdocs? You fund them. It seems to me very simple. I read a lot of complex kind of jumping through hoops about this, but it's rather simple actually. If you pay for those places, then more people will do it, and you'll have a higher skilled workforce. And I don't think there's anything more to say about it.
But there is an issue about keeping people in academia rather than and working with industry as well. But I think there is that sense that we're losing some of our brightest graduates very early on, and I wonder what we can do other than just pay them as much as they earn.
No, I don't mean necessarily pay them more. I mean make sure the jobs are available. It's as again, if you go back to STFC, I just keep mentioning that because I know about STFC. The problem, if there's a bad settlement in the CSR, will be that there isn't enough money to fund postdocs. In fact, there won't be enough money to fund PhD studentships. So we won't have those people. So it seems rather simple. I've never seen, at Manchester, I haven't seen a lack of demand amongst the students I teach. I teach 280 students in the first year at Manchester in physics. And many of them will come to me and I'll say, what would you like to do? And they say, I want to do a PhD in something or other. And the problem, of course, is that it's good, there's a high level of competition for PhD places, but we could fill many more. We have PhD students and postdocs are extremely valuable to researchers. They mean that we do better research because the academics have more intellectual support, and we could fill twice as many places. It's simply a question of funding at that relatively small level.
Okay.
Professor Cox, thank you for your time today. I don't think that there's anyone in this room who would question the fact that we urgently need the case for science to be made as loudly as possible. You are someone who's particularly good at making the case for science in a way that can be understood by all sections of society, and I think on behalf of the committee we'd like to thank you for the work that you do in making sure that happens. We've heard your concerns about the possible outcome of the spending review, and we will take note of those, and also your views about the way in which science spending could amplify the impacts of spending in the UK economy. Thank you for your time. That brings this session to a close. Order, order.